Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And welcome back to another exciting episode of this series on modern Iran. As always, I am very lucky to be joined by Hunger the Dye Merchant. How are you, Hunger?
I'm doing very well. Happy Saturday morning, everybody.
Yes, and well, let's just say when we're talking about Iran today, it's not exactly going to be very happy for what they had to go through in this period from the latter 17th century through most of the 18th century, where you'd have the stagnation, decline of the Safavid Empire, and then many civil wars, ethnic conflicts, interregnums, until the countries were unified under the Qajar dynasty in the 1790s. And
Yeah, after we teased at the end of the last episode, we said it was going to be all downhill from there, and it really is all downhill from there. But that doesn't mean there weren't interesting things that happened, and that doesn't mean there were within that decline periods of periods of prosperity, actually, which is the general decline was, I think, unstoppable. But there were many attempts to get Iran back on its feet, and we're gonna get into that in this chapter.
One thing I should illustrate is that I think what fundamentally changes between the beginning of this period and the end is that with the collapse of the Safavid Empire, Iran loses its great power status and irrevocably going forward would just be a regional power, and that's what I think the real loss of all of this was. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
For sure, and that's because you have the rise of like the actual great powers like Russia, like the Ottoman Empire. Because even in the 1600s, the Ottoman was not at it had peaked, but it didn't. Its decline was much slower, but it still retained a lot of its power, especially even in Europe, in the Middle East, and the Caucasus for far longer than Iran did. But yeah, like powers like Russia, powers like the British and the Dutch, they became genuine world powers, whereas Iran could only play within its backyard, and that it remains so for the entirety of its history till today.
No, certainly. So to start things off, we last time we finished up talking about Abbas II, who is seen as the last of the great Safavid rulers, because he's the last one that you really see any kind of military successes. But you also do see beginnings of decline because, as I mentioned, he had a tendency to implement essentially a form of royal isolationism, where he would be lock himself in the harem for weeks on end and just do nothing but sort of binge on alcohol and engage in various sexual activities within the harem. And obviously, he would end up dying out of a combination of syphilis and a throat cancer. And we now come to the reign of his son, Suleiman I. And I mean, Suleiman's succession, again, is just emblematic of essentially the shit show that the Safavid central government had become, because for starters, as I mentioned last time, the Grand Vizier had no idea that the Shah had any sons, and it wasn't until they were brought out of the harem that he realized. And so there were essentially two sons who were put forward. You have Suleiman here, birth name was Sam Mirza, and he was about 19 at the time, and he had a younger brother who was only about 7, and the eunuchs actually wanted to make the younger son the Shah because it'd be easier to control. And one of the other eunuchs was like, okay, we could do that, but that's probably not a good idea for the stability of the realm that we have a child. So I think we should stick with Sam Mirza because he's at least an adult, and wiser heads prevailed, and they put Suleiman in. And so he would...
For once, the eunuchs did not fuck it up.
Yes. Unfortunately, Suleiman would not really prove to be a very great ruler, but it could have been worse had they put the child in. So,
yeah, a big through line in Iran's history is that the regencies of these very young shahs is not a great time. It's a great time for military conquest, but it is not a great time for the stability of the realm. And that's all I'll say for now.
I just had a comment come in. No curtain. I'm very familiar with decline. I'm Canadian. Oof, that's a very very sad statement. Yeah. Right. So, okay. So Suleiman comes in. He's about 19. He's relatively young and inexperienced, and His reign as a whole would be relatively stable, but be stagnation all around, really. But what's interesting is that his first year and a half of his reign was actually very chaotic because one, there was a very bad harvest, so there was a lot of famine in the countryside. And worse, there was actually a threat of attack because last time we talked about the first of the Russo-Persian Wars. Well, in the early months of Suleiman's reign, there was a Cossack a leader called Stepan Razin, and he's in a lot of conflict with Tsar Alexis in Russia, and to try and gain sort of wealth and resources and sort of prestige, he essentially launches these sort of piratical raids across the Caspian into northern Iran, devastating Mazandaran and that sort of area on the Caspian, and that didn't help with the poor harvest either. And at one point, Stepan was going to meet with Suleiman to try and negotiate to see if he could become like a vassal of the Shah because he'd fallen out with Tsar Alexis, and but he ended up losing interest and just buggering off back to Russia, where he ends up being executed by the Tsar. But it's just incredible, isn't it? That you've literally, I never heard of this before. You piratical Cossacks raiding over the Caspian into Iran.
Yeah, that is I had not heard that as well before you just told me that. I don't believe that is in Amanat's book. So that is some very interesting research right there. But yeah, actually this is actually a very interesting topic because piracy is a very large problem that the Persians face, especially in the later half of the 17th century and early half of the 18th century. Piracy is just endemic. It starts with the Dutch in the Persian Gulf, but it expands into the Omani Arab pirates in the Persian Gulf, which totally cripples the Iranian coastline, and even and the Cossack pirates in the Caspian Sea, which is pretty crazy if you know the history of the Cossacks.
No, certainly. And again, there's long running thread of Russia becoming an existential threat to Iran. But what ends up happening is because interestingly, when he first became Shah, Suleiman was actually not the regnal name he took. He actually took the name Safi II after his grandfather, who we talked about last stream. And what ends up happening is because the early reign is so disastrous, his court astrologers kind of come to him and say, we got off to a bad start. We need to recoronate you, and you need to pick a new name. So in Nowruz, in the Iranian New Year, in March 1668, he has a second coronation where he actually adopts the name Suleiman. So again, a very weird element there.
Isn't there another Safi II, like in the 1700s, or am I confusing someone else?
No, there wouldn't be another Safi II. No. After Suleiman, you have Sultan Hosein. You then have a Tahmasp II, and then you have an Abbas III, who's the last of the Safavids.
Yeah, I should just point out just on that point in 1666, which is the day where Suleiman is coronated as the Shah. Amanat goes into a very long, detailed section of his book on the climatic element and the agricultural element and the economy of Iran in this period. It's actually very interesting. It's actually a very interesting section of the book. I'm going to see if I can pull up a few pages of it, but the long story of it is that with the there was a somewhat cold period in this time in the late 1600s, early 1700s, that contributes to a huge decline in agricultural production, very bad harvests, and this in turn causes absolute, I don't want to say chaos, but an enormous decline in the productivity and stability of rural Persia and Iran, where these ethnic nomadic tribes start getting very uppity because of the lack of resources and because of the depopulation, because of the decrease in agriculture. Do you have anything more to say on that?
Well, before we kind of got to that and the various ethnic tribal uprisings, I wanted to really talk a bit more about Suleiman, his son Sultan Hosein, and the general court culture and in around Isfahan and the religious.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So one other thing that's interesting with Suleiman is that so the year after he's had his second coronation, he appoints a very able Grand Vizier, Sheikh Ali Khan Zanganeh, who rules the empire for the next 20 years. So again, there's this trend of you have these shahs who aren't really interested in ruling, very kind of decadent, kind of just wanting to stay in the harem and drink and screw all day. But then, thankfully, Suleiman is served by a very able Grand Vizier who's able to keep things ticking over. But just to get into a little bit more of Suleiman's character, there's a very interesting activity he partakes in, which he and his son Soltan Hosein would partake in as well, called the a kuruk. And so this is essentially an extension of the policy of royal isolationism, where Suleiman never actually, didn't really like leaving the harem, and in his entire life he never actually left Isfahan. So he's incredibly like closeted. Like he doesn't make any kind of sojourns around the realm to meet any vassals or any of his subjects. And he's like, and it also should be noted that he doesn't actually allow any of the commoners to meet him for any petitions or any redress. And his father Abbas II was the last Safavid Shah to allow that. So again, the increasing separation of the monarchy from the subject. And going back to this idea of kuruk, this is so strange because it is an element of Suleiman going out into the world, but still it's a form of isolationism, because what a kuruk is, it's that, so when a shah is in the harem, the women are supposed to stay in the harem, they're not supposed to leave the harem or be seen by anyone else. And so what a kuruk is Suleiman will take his royal entourage, so take his harem women and some of his guards, and he will venture out into Isfahan to ride about the city on like a royal tour. But with a kuruk, because he's got his harem with him, it's essentially like a form of like a harem caravan or mobile harem. So the rules of the harem still apply. So no men are allowed to see them. So when he goes and plans to do this, he has his government officials say to the district in Isfahan where the Shah wants to visit, right, all of you need to clear out because the Shah's going to come with his harem. And the Shah will turn up and just ride around with his harem women. And if any male over the age of 6, note 6 years old, witnessed the kuruk, they'd be executed.
Yeah, crazy stuff. Yeah, it's actually very interesting. The Ottomans, the pair that we talked about this in the previous stream, but the parallels between the Safavids and the Ottomans in terms of the harem system and the tribal loyalties is incredibly pertinent. All of these shahs were raised in the harem. The Ottomans had a different word for it. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it was like the gilded cage of these rulers that would be brought up while the very masculine, manly tribal chieftains would decide, governmental policy.
No, absolutely. And to say, just to talk about some wider culture under Suleiman. This was largely as a result of the long peace, because last time we talked about the Peace of Sahab. So after the end of this Ottoman Safavid War in the 1630s, you have this 80-year peace from 1639 to 1722, and this led to a great cultural flourishing. And there are many famous poets such as Sayyid Tabrizi, and commoners would often gather in the coffee houses of the cities like Isfahan and Shiraz, and they partake in odes known as ghazals and poetry competitions called Mushaira, and you'd have recitals of parts of the Shahnameh. You'd also have popularity of the taverns, which feature card games, chess, music, and dancing. Now, the ulama obviously frowned upon such activities, but the Safavid patronage of these activities meant the ulama couldn't really quite outright ban these activities, at least under Suleiman. And you also have wine drinking and opium consumption were also very, very popular, but they did start to crack down on that a little bit. They also, interestingly enough, we were just talking about the harem, brothels were legalized during this period, and they were actually regulated by the states. You actually have state-enforced regulated prostitution in Iran during this period.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And actually, just like in the European capitals of the time, it wasn't just wine drinking and paint and arts. It was also coffee houses. Coffee houses were extremely popular. They were coming into existence at this time in Iran. They were springing up everywhere after the 1500s. But this is especially the time of like the place of the coffee houses and the social polity were very actually influential. And I'm going to read maybe 2 paragraphs of Amanat's book on the coffee houses. The culture of leisure and pastime was appealing to the urban public. Despite occasional religious sanctions, the number of coffee houses, taverns, and pleasure houses, known as brothels, increased throughout the realm. Consumption of tea and coffee, the former from China and later from India, and the latter from Arabia and the Levant, particularly Yemen. Yemen was the source of coffee in the Arabian world, and that was where coffee was exported from. Just as an aside, it was Yemeni coffee, which is that's how we get the name Arabica for the coffee beans that everyone still drinks to this day. But continuing from Amanat, made coffee houses an alternative to taverns. In the mid-17th century, we know that there were at least 6 major coffee houses in Isfahan alone. Poetic competitions, chess matches, card and board games, music and dancing, and readings of the Shamana, and other action-packed Persian epics and romances attracted the male public as well as the royals. On their nocturnal rounds, Abbas I and later his successors visited coffee houses and listened to poetry readings. One of the reasons, no doubt, for these public venues' survival, even though they were frowned upon by the ulama. Later on, storytellers of the Safavid coffee houses incorporated into their repertoire Shia stories and performances, such as the popular Hamza Name, which narrated in accessible language the fantastic exploits of Hamza, the Prophet's uncle. Other epics in praise of Ali, the first Imam, were also recited in public by storytellers. The clergy and government authorities remained suspicious of coffee houses' subversive ambience, of their habitats, and their storytellers. And not without reason, Jean Chardin, the French traveler who visited Persia, informs us that free and open expressions of beliefs and opinions, presumably religious and political, in Isfahan coffee houses were unique in the world. As a part of the global trend, one cannot fail to note the budding Safavid public space comparable not only to the similar Ottoman and Egyptian establishments, but also to the French salons and English coffee houses of the period. Yeah, very interesting stuff. The coffee houses were incredible. Were the main source of public, art and intellectual discussion, just as they were in Europe. Fascinating.
And that's certainly, and just very quickly, because talking about popular items of consumption, the tobacco imported from the New World also became very popular around this time. And a lesser known fact about Iran, but this will get into this in later streams, but Iran would actually end up becoming quite a large producer of tobacco in the 19th century because the country has the appropriate climate for growing it, and it would become a very popular recreational activity to smoke tobacco. And you also mentioned Chardin there. Yes, so there was even more Western observers showing up in this period. So you've got Jean Chardin and Jean-Baptiste Tavernier wearing elaborate Persian dress there on the right. They were both French Huguenot merchants. Tavernier, I believe, was actually a jewelry and gem merchant. And so, for example, Chardin first visited in the year that Suleiman became Shah, and he would make many return trips, and he would actually publish a multi-volume account of Iran in 1686. And he actually was very influential on the European commentary on Iran, especially being French. So most of the other commentators from this point onwards would be French. You got Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire. And what's also interesting is something that Amanat comments on is that despite the European interest in Iran, the Iranians correspondingly were actually not that interested in Europe itself. So in a way, Iran, you can almost say this is the beginning of Orientalism, where it's this sort of fascination as the East as some exotic place to have an adventure in.
Oh, absolutely. We discussed this in the previous stream, and we've discussed Orientalism quite a bit of times, quite a number of times in our series together.
Yes, and not only in addition to Chardin, Tavernier would also publish accounts of his travels in Persia, both of which have been translated into English, so people actually want to. And because I've been reading a translation of the Tadirat al-Muluk, which is the Memorial of Kings, a Safavid administration manual, and the Russian translator of that book, Vladimir Minorsky, one of the works he's comparing it with was Chardon and Tavernier's writings, because until he translated the Memorial of Kings, Chardon and Tavernier were the best primary sources for the Safavid courts in the West. So they are very valuable for that reason alone. And just from there, I now want to turn a little bit to the sort of religious policies around this time. So here on the right, I have a fellow called Mohammed Bakr Majlesi. So he becomes a very important figure in the very last years of Suleiman and in the early years of his son Sultan Hosein, who I've got pictured on the left. So when the Grand Vizier Zand dies in 1689, that's around the time Majlesi becomes the dominant figure at court. So from 1689 until Sultan Hosein becomes Shah, he's the Sheikh al-Islam, so he's the chief imam of the capital. And he would actually become so influential over the young Sultan Hosein that Sultan Hosein would actually create a new position for him at the court called the Mullah Bashi, or head mullah, which became the new highest religious office in the realm, even eclipsing that of the Sada, or the Heart, which had been around since the days of Tamaspa and Ismail. So again, a lot of power was entrusted into him by Sultan Hosein, and it's around this time he's affiliated with a movement.
Just a question on that. Was this new position different than the Sheikh al-Islam? Because that was also an existing religious title in Iran.
Yeah, so Sheikh al-Islam was just the imam that was responsible for religious services in the capital of Isfahan. So they would have been responsible for the Shah Mosque and any religious practices in the capital. So essentially, a little bit like an Islamic bishop, essentially. A bit like you've got the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Archbishop of York, for example. So Mullah Bashi was a brand new court position that was explicitly given and made for Majlesi.
Okay, I see. So like the Pope of Shia Islam.
Essentially, yeah. And so with Majlesi, there's a rise of a movement that's called Akbarism, or the idea that there's a reliance on the reports of the hadiths during this late era of the Safavids. So it's chiefly promoted by Majlesi. And so he composes 26 volumes of commentary on the hadiths. And he also writes, which is known as the Bihar al-Anwar, or Oceans of Luminescence. And he writes many other important works, such as the Jala al-Uyun, Sparkle of the Eyes, a narrative work in the suffering of the Shia Imams, which he had have recited from mosques and used during the morning processions during the month of Muharram. Who would also write the Zad al-Mad, Provisions for the Day of Return, a set of instructions for Shia ritual and devotional acts. Also the Hilyat al-Mutakin, the Cloak of the Pious, which contains invocations and thaumaturgical instructions for a wide range of human activities. And again, this was all part patronized by Suleiman, who was, even though he was relatively, isolationist, he was actually very deeply pious. And so I have to wonder if the sponsoring of Majlesi's activities was some kind of, I don't know, like cope over his rather degenerate lifestyle.
Oh, we've never seen that before in Iranian history. No. How could you say such a thing?
No, indeed, and in terms of
but there's always a very interesting tension, and we've discussed this before, of course, between the degenerate court and the prestige, or maybe prestige is not the right word, but the place of pride of the ulama that always goes back and forth, and it's a very uneasy relationship at many times.
But what's interesting is that you very much get a sense of Amanat that he sees the ulama, then they're dominant, this conservative clergy. If you read between the lines, it's almost like he's sort of blaming their influence for the stagnation of Iran during this period. Would you say that's fair?
That's fair, and given that given the interview I've watched of Amanat, I think that's a safe assumption to make. But I mean, it's very interesting. Like there's the through line of the Persian history that Amanat, writes about very well. The through line is these Shahs live an extremely degenerate lifestyle, and Amanat is very good at highlighting and writing about the liberal, artistic, intellectual atmosphere. And he writes about it very well and very beautifully, actually. But he does not seem to make the connection between the degeneracy and the decline of the empire. The conservatism of Islam is there throughout the book in the background, and he's very quick to bring up people who, for lack of a better word, shit on the ulama.
No, certainly. And one other thing we should mention about Majlesi is that he also does repress religious minorities such as Zoroastrianism's Hindus and the special people. If you know who I'm talking about, he actually wrote this anti-special people treatise. The Persian name is the Sawaik al-Yahud. I will not provide an English translation of that title because it's deeply anti-Semitic, is all I'll say.
Enough said.
No, and yeah, so Amanat also says that there's very little change in the ulama from the time of Al-Karaki, who was the Shaykh al-Islam under Tamaz, all through to Majlesi, and the ulama were ultimately very critical of any artistic pursuits and had a very haughty attitude. They usually had a good relationship with the Safavids in spite of occasional disagreements, and what ensures this is they are somewhat dependent because of the Orkaf or Wakaf system of charitable endowments, meaning they are still somewhat financially dependent upon the court and the monarchy. And what's also interesting is remembering the Arabic origins of many of the ulama. Many of them still didn't bother learning Persian, so there was a language barrier which sort of somewhat isolated them from the general population as well.
Yeah, and they were particularly specifically Shia Lebanese from the southern Lebanon region, and this is probably something we haven't discussed, but I think it's important to bring up that this tension between the ulama and I guess you can say the liberal artistic population of Iran that Amanat is very focused on. I mean, not for bad reasons. The Persian art and history and culture is incredibly important, and Amanat does bring that to the fore. But the general population of Persia, even though they love their coffee houses, they love the poetry readings and all this stuff, the installation of Shia Islam and the conservative elements of Shia Islam were always there, and I don't think that's given enough credit. That the Safavids were incredibly successful in instilling the Shia ideology onto the Persians, and through the work of the ulama, and the ulama were responsible for like the social morality standards, but that was incredibly successful, even if liberal artisans did not like the restrictions.
No, absolutely, and it should also be noted that with the ulama, their main success was actually the suppression of Sufism. We went over that last time because the Safavids themselves turned on the Sufis, seeing them as this sort of essentially, tribal heretics, and they very much became much more conventionally religious, whereas they were less successful in suppressing art and poetry. What I now want to do is talk a little bit now about Soltan Hosein. Obviously, there's a couple of other Safavids after him, but he's really the last real Shah that has any kind of authority or respect, frankly. So again, he's not too dissimilar to his father. In fact, when he becomes Shah, it's again like the situation with his father. There's a little bit of it's essentially he's declared it by the royal council and the Grand Vizier, and what ends up happening is that when Suleiman died, he actually writes an instruction guide of what to do with the succession to the royal council, just saying, he had two sons, he had Sultan Hussein and another son, and he just said, if And then if you want like a strong ruler, pick this son. If you want someone you can easily manage, choose this son. And they went with Sultan Hussein because he was the one that could easily manage. So it's just incredible, isn't it, that there's this complete, disinterest in ensuring a strong, effective royal line.
No, absolutely, and the succession crises is again something that's going to plague is a part of the decline that we see in Iran from the latter half of the 17th century onwards. And there's going to be many regents that will try to take the throne, but there's also, I mean, Amanat says this in the book. There's a very interesting interplay where the grand viziers never fully capture the state power in the way that the Sublime Porte does in the Ottoman Empire. The Sublime Porte takes over the Ottoman government, and the sultans are basically, figureheads going on from the 1700s till, World War One. That most of them are just figures of a gilded cage, very controlled, living in the harem, while the Sublime Porte does all the administrative and government work. The same thing. The Grand Viziers try to do the same thing in Safavid Iran, but are much less successful because they always get these shahs that are uppity, and they try to steer government policy in directions they want, to the dislike of the Grand Viziers.
Well, it's interesting because I was reading some work by Michael Axworthy, who's another Iranologist who I've consulted for this series, and he's got an interesting theory regarding the decline of the Safavid state under Sultan Hosein, and his view is that the problem and why we get the collapse of Iran is because for the system to survive, you had to have competent ministers who would be rewarded by the Shah and have an active monarchy. The problem is, because Sultan Hussein wasn't active and was disinterested, when you have someone who wants to try and fix a problem, all the other rivals at court don't want them to succeed because it means their own influence and power will diminish. So they're incentivized to stop successes and to make sure that their rivals are murdered and never succeed. So you have this kind of, it's like crabs in a bucket, essentially, where no one's allowed to fix any problems lest someone get powerful and influential. And what compounds this is that anybody who was powerful enough to have any ability to steer things and will end up dying. So, for example, Majlesi dies in 1698. So after his death, the next main stabilizing force at court is a woman called Maryam Begum, who is the Shah's great aunt. She's a sister of Shah Safi. And the thing is, she is actually, when she dies in 1720, I believe she's in her 90s, so she was incredibly old, and she was a very savvy woman, and she was able to steer her grandnephew, and so things didn't get too out of hand. But when she dies in the 1720, that was the last, I think, person of any sense who was around who could have stopped things going down the ship pan, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, when the Shah becomes disinterested and retreats to his like palace and his harem, the vacuum that it leaves has to get filled, and that increases all the other ministers' competition for that power. And so again, nothing gets done. There becomes a court what's called court intrigue, and a courtly civil war, not a countrywide civil war, but a courtly civil war, because of that. There's that vacuum of power with an inactive Shah.
No, certainly. And now I think we need to move on to the actual breakdown of the Safavid monarchy and the so-called Afghan crisis. So, okay, I'm going to do another reading from the book. So, resurgence of the periphery. So, despite relative urban calm in the late Safavid era, pressure on the empire's frontiers continued to build. Following the death of Abbas I in 1629, Iran experienced yet another Ottoman onslaught, this time under Sultan Murad IV, the last of the great Ottoman conquerors. After nearly 3 decades of calm and without any provocation, massive Ottoman armies occupied the western Iranian provinces. Facing resistance in Tabriz and Hamadan, the Ottomans did not hesitate to massacre the population and lay waste to the cities. In 1638, Baghdad also fell into Ottoman hands, this time permanently. Despite stiff Iranian resistance, the Safavid state acted circumspectly. The conclusion in 1639 of the Treaty of Zohab once again called for the Ottomans' evacuation of western Iran in exchange for the permanent annexation of southern Iraq. The fragile border between the two empires thus was set roughly along the lines of the previous 1555 Amasya Treaty, even though Iran had to face yet another Ottoman occupation in the early 18th century. On another front, facing the Uzbeks' recurring attacks also obliged the Safavids to act with caution as the Central States began to feel the financial burden of waging war on two fronts. The centralizing policies of Abbas I and his successors transformed most semi-autonomous provinces, Mamluk, into crown property. Direct crown brought greater revenue, especially in Fars, the Caucasus and Khorasan, but it also made the empire more vulnerable on the periphery. To remedy such peripheral pressures, Abbas had already implemented a complex policy of tribal resettlement. The nomadic defensive walls in the west and east temporarily fended off the external threat, while diminishing tribal tensions in the interiors. As many as 15,000 Kurdish families resettled in the northern Khorasan so as to create a dependable barrier against the Uzbeks' forays. But by the last quarter of the 17th century, the Safavid Empire, like its Muslim neighbours to the west and the east, encountered increased threats along its frontiers and trade routes and a variety of nomadic powers. In the Caucasus, the Lezgian tribes of the Dagestan and other semi-nomadic peoples of the Transcaucasus, including the Cossacks, ravaged the prosperous Shirvan region and threatened the overland Caspian trade. To the west, the Kurdish tribes of the Persian and Ottoman frontiers captured Kermanshah and Hamadan, both centres for trade with Mesopotamia and the Levant. In the south, the coastal Arab tribes, often in collaboration with Omani pirates based in around Muscat, pose a similar threat to the Persian Gulf trade. In Khuzestan, the remnants of the Mushashah autonomous region in the marshlands of Huiza were in periodic rebellion. And in the southeast, the Baluk tribes of the Makran region began to make raids on the eastern trade of Hindustan. This unrest at the periphery was not uncommon, especially during times of trouble in the centre, yet the simultaneous revolt of so many frontier forces at once was highly unusual. The most significant and fatal blow came from the revolt of the Galzai Afghan tribes of Kandahar province in today's southern Afghanistan. A coveted Safavid southeastern stronghold and frontier trade centre, the possession of Kandahar was long disputed by the Mughal Empire. Though by 1653 the Safavids had managed to make Kandahar their own, their reassertion of city control bred much anti-Persian sentiment. As early as 1701, after several petitions to the Safavid court, Mir Vaiz Hutaki, the mayor Kalantar of Kandahar, who resented the anti-Sunni policies of the Safavid state, rose in rebellion and murdered the Safavid governor-general of the province, who was a Georgian of Ghulam origin. Mir Vaiz was supported by his Galzai kinsmen in the vicinity of the city and backed by the Mughal emperor Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb's policy towards the Safavids was guided not only by Mughal territorial claims over Kandahar, but also by a new spirit of Sunni reassertion. The Kandahar rebellion, also blessed by the anti-Shia fatwas of the Meccan jurists, successfully resisted the Safavids' reprisal. Less than 2 decades later, Mir Vaiz's son, Mahmud, in collusion with the subordinate Afghan and Baluk tribes, felt confident enough to raid the Iranian interior and go as far as attempting to lay siege to the cities of Kerman and Yazd, albeit unsuccessfully. These would be rehearsals for what came in 1722, when Mahmud Hutaki laid siege to Isfahan, a city virtually intact and long unaccustomed to nomadic incursions. Shah Sultan Hosein proved utterly helpless in his handling of the Afghan crisis. He was the quintessential product of the confined upbringing in the harem. Even if we allow for some exaggeration in the European and Ottoman eyewitness accounts of the Safavid capital, they convincingly portray a government on the verge of collapse with rebellious and insurrections in the making, and an army unprepared to fight, statesmen and army chiefs in the throes of ethnic and factional disputes, and an indecisive Shah incapable of controlling his quarrelling courtiers, many wives, eunuchs, clerical dignitaries, and corrupt officials. Shortly before the attack by the Afghans, the elimination of Faf Ali Khan Dagestani, the Grand Vizier, and decimation of his allies in the Safavid army on charges of Sunni proclivities shook not only the administrative and financial stability of the empire, but also its defences. The downfall of the shrewd Lezgian minister, who early had established his power base in Georgia, was one example of how the spread of Shiism in the Safavid realms gradually eroded tribal support for the empire on the Sunni periphery. The air of complacency that set in at the Isfahan court after decades of trouble-free lives of both luxury and laxity, as well as religious zealous policies, was to be rudely interrupted by the arrival of a half-starving, ragged band of nomads. At the Battle of Gulnabad on the outskirts of Isfahan in May 1722, the more numerous and better equipped Safavid forces were defeated by no more than 20,000 Afghans, who forced the Safavids to retreat behind the city walls. Somewhat surprised by the ease with which they had routed the imperial army, the Afghan forces laid siege to the capital and waited for the starved and terrified population of the city to surrender. Empty coffers and sheer incompetence of the Shah and his administration deprived Isfahan even of the backing of the Georgian mercenaries who had been summoned to the capital. During the 7-month siege, vital links with the outside were severed and the supply of provisions was blocked. Once the city dwellers had consumed the cats and dogs, they devoured rats. Reports of eating corpses became rampant. Then the disease-ravaged city caved and defences crumbled. Once inside the walls of Isfahan, Mahmud and his troops rode through the deserted streets and bazaars before arriving at the Chehel Sultan Palace. There, the Galzai Khan unceremoniously enthroned himself as Mahmud Shah. He detained the royal family and divided up the Safavid household and the harem as booty for himself and his chiefs. It did not take long before he found himself presiding over an empire riddled with rebellion and chaos. What interested the Afghan invaders, however, was not the running of a broken empire, but the wealth of the capital and the glitter of royal edifices such as the Chehel Sultan, which whetted the invaders' appetite for plunder. At the outset, Mahmud tried to act graciously towards the people of Isfahan, and to some degree even to remedy the problems of the war-ravaged and starving capital. By the end of the Isfahan siege, nearly 80,000 inhabitants had perished. He also enjoyed the support of Jews and Zoroastrians of Isfahan and elsewhere in the empire, who had long been felt the discrimination of the Safavids' religious policies. Yet soon his attitude began to change as he sensed persistent loyalty to the Safavids within the divan and among the population at large. Insecure and paranoid, he quickly resorted to violence. He executed nearly all of Sultan Hosein's sons and relatives. The Shah himself was spared, only to later die at the hand of Ashraf, Mahmud's nephew and successor. A vast number of the ranking officials who ran the Safavid divan also fell victim to repeated massacres that were motivated by the Afghans' fear of mass uprising. Even the Armenians, considered the Safavids' favoured minority, did not fare any better. The city quarter of New Jalfa was plundered, houses and churches destroyed, women and children enslaved. The occupation of Isfahan and the collapse of the Safavid sent signals to the former empire's western neighbours. Almost immediately, a new Ottoman campaign was launched by the Pasha of Baghdad under the pretext of restoring the former Safavid Shah to the throne. In response, in 1726, Ashraf Hutaki, whose survival on the Iranian throne was at stake, executed Sultan Hosein and sent his head to the Ottoman Pasha as proof of the Safavids' demise. Even if the last of the Safavid Shahs could have repelled the Afghans, it's debatable whether the demise of the dynasty could have been averted. So we can see what an absolute mess the empire has become. You kind of have this Afghan army under Mahmud essentially go on what was essentially a tribal raid, and after failing to besiege Kerman and Yazd, then just turn up to Isfahan. They finally surprisingly rout the royal army, which had been riddled with corruption and decades of inexperience and not having fought any one of the decades, and then they just siege the capital, and then he makes himself the Shah, and chaos ensues. And so now you've got the Afghans occupying the centre and east of the country. You've got the Ottomans occupying your western provinces. The Russians come in and occupy the northern provinces, and it's absolute bedlam. And what ends up happening is Mahmud's nephew Ashraf ends up usurping Mahmud in 1726 and makes himself the Shah. And then you see in the east, in the Hotat lands in Afghanistan, Mahmud's younger brother ends up making himself the new emir. And is there anything you want to comment regarding this incident at all? Or?
Yeah, I think this also speaks to what you were saying earlier, the liberalism of the capital and the generosity of the people in Isfahan. They did not see this coming. They were not used to the hardship of nomadic raids, as opposed to other areas of the countryside, and it came as an incredible surprise to them that the Safavid army collapsed so quickly and so precipitously.
No, certainly. And so despite the execution of Sultan Hosein, one of his sons, Tahmasp, who declared himself as Tahmasp II, is alive. And what ends up happening is two of the Kizilbash tribes, the Afshars and the Qajars, are both fighting for the control of the young Tahmasp, because obviously if they can help place him on the throne, they'll obviously have significant influence over the new Shah. And bridging the Afshars, we now have to talk about Nader Shah. And so for those who don't know, so Nader Shah was a member of the Afsharid tribal Kizilbash tribe. So the this they were originally, their power base was in Khorasan in the northeast around Mashhad, and they were mostly responsible for defending the northeastern frontier from the Uzbeks. So Nader Shah comes up from this very tribal, peripheral upbringing, and it's during this time of chaos that he rises to become very powerful, and eventually becomes the Shah himself in 1736. And I'm going to do some more reading, but just before we get into that, I'm just going to say that Nader Shah I find to be an incredibly fascinating figure, because on the one hand, I think he's one of the greatest rulers in Iranian history. But on the other hand, I also think he's one of the worst rulers in Iranian history. Do you have any reaction to that at all, or what do you think?
I completely agree. So before you get into your reading, of course, Nader Shah, before he becomes the ruler of Iran, is, how do I say it? I should start before that. While the Afghan crisis is happening in Iran, as you said, the Ottomans invade the west, the Russians invade from the north, and this is very bad. This is a very bad situation for Safavid Iran. The Ottoman excuse actually is, we don't like these Afghans. We're going to invade Iran to reimpose Tahmasp II onto the throne. And the Russians did not come up with that excuse, but both leaders, the Ottoman Sultan and the Russian Emperor, both both preferred negotiating with Tahmasp II because they viewed him as the legitimate ruler of Safavid Iran. And Mahmud Shah did not like this, and he had to make some territorial concessions to gain the legitimacy from the Ottomans and the Russians, which I don't think succeeded on his end. But yes, it's time for us to talk about Nader Shah.
No, indeed. And I just do want to read another segment from the Amanat book. So, Nader Kohli as the liberator. Few leaders in recent Iranian history have provoked such conflicting sentiments as Nader Shah Afshar, a military genius who emerged out of the post-Safavid interregnum to put an end to foreign occupations and soon to the Safavid dynasty itself. His countrymen viewed him first as a restorer of the empire and a saviour, but later a tyrant and a maniac. For his contemporary Europeans, he was a thundering conqueror whose Indian campaign paved the way for British colonial domination. To the incoming Qajar dynasty, he was a despicable usurper, yet in the Pahlavi era, he was glorified as a hero and the forerunner of national unity, a prototype of a sort of Reza Shah, who admired him for his discipline and resolve. Today, he is still part of Iran's nationalist narrative, appealing to the pan-Iranian sentiments of some and the anti-clerical aspirations of others. Before the constructs of the later centuries, however, Nader looms large as a unique phenomenon, in some ways reasserting tribal identity of the Iranian periphery, and in other ways as a prototype anticipating the nationalist trends of later centuries. Born around 1688 to a poor herding family among the Turkmen nomads of northern Khorasan, Nader Kohli belonged to the Kerebklu subdivision of the Afshar tribe, one of the original members of the Kezelbash. The Kerebklu had been resettled in the hinterlands of Mashhad under Abbas I, primarily to repel frequent incursions by the Uzbeks, who pillaged widely and enslaved the Shiite residents of towns and villages. As a youth, he apparently was taken captive by the Uzbeks, living as a hostage slave for 4 years before escaping captivity and leading a life of banditry. Soon after, Nader Kohli joined Malek Mahmud Sistani, a self-styled claimant to the legendary Qayanid dynasty of the Shahnameh. In the years following the collapse of the Safavid state, he had carved out territory for himself that stretched from northern Khorasan to Sistan, with his capital in Mashhad. Relying on a loose tribal and urban coalition, Malek Mahmud soon viewed Nader, then a local warlord, and his band of nomadic horsemen as a threat to his aspirations. It is not unlikely that his claim to kingship of the legendary dynasty, complete with an invented Qayanid crown and regal symbolism, inspired Nader's image of himself as a champion of a unified Iran, a concept of authority different from the Safavids' claim to Shiite sacred kingship. Just to quickly address a comment in the chat. So, John, real name, we at the Qajars already? No, we'll get to the Qajars later. We're talking about the Afsharids at the moment.
The Qajars are around, but they're a tribe that is around also in northern Iran, but they are not the central family of the story.
Well, not yet anyway. So, okay, Nader nevertheless lost out to Malek Mahmud in the struggle for control of Mashhad. He returned to the life of a benevolent bandit, as his largesse helped at times to swell the ranks of his supporters. By 1725, when he offered his services to Tahmasp II, he probably mustered no more than 2,000 horsemen with shaky loyalty and no artillery or any other heavy weapons. What he really offered to Tahmasp, who was helplessly vacillating among several tribal contenders, was an instinctive ability to lead, military talent, and tactful strategizing. Soon he elevated himself to become Tahmasp's regent after successfully masterminding the slaying of his Qajar rival. This was the first step in a willful struggle that eventually brought him to the throne of Iran. Adopting the title of Tahmasp Koli, slave of Tahmasp, within a year he was able to secure his base in Khorasan and sack Mashhad, removing Malek Mahmud. Soon after, in a series of successful campaigns, in 1727 he first subdued the restive Abdali Afghans in Herat and prepared to march against the occupying Galzai Afghans in Isfahan. Routing Ashraf's forces in 2 battles, first near Damgan and then in Mershekot in the vicinity of Isfahan, in December 1729, he triumphantly entered the Safavid capital in the company of Tahmasp II. Restoring the Safavid Shah to his throne added to Nader's prestige, although the pillage and killing of Isfahan's population by the Liberation Army was an ominous sign of what was to come. Marching to Fars, he pushed the demoralized Afghan forces southeast. Ashraf and a few of his companions were killed on the way to Kandahar, but a remnant of troops who survived the battle conveniently joined Nader's forces. In an ever-growing enterprise for conquest, he soon turned his attention towards the provinces under Ottoman and Russian occupation. Key to Nader's early successes and his meteoric rise was a talent for organizing disjointed tribal groups into an army. These included Kurdish tribes of Khorasan, some of the Qajars and their Turkmen allies, the Baluk and other tribes of the southeast, the Abdali and Galzai Afghans, and even the Uzbeks. He often took command of these disparate nomadic forces by enticing their chiefs to join him, only to eliminate them at an opportune moment. What made his enterprise different from familiar Turco-Mongolian tribal ventures of the past was that the multi-ethnic character of Nader's army almost incorporated a contingent of peasants displaced from the interior. Perhaps for the first time in Iranian history, and possibly in the history of empires in the region, his crude method of drafting able-bodied men from remote villages and towns, often without serious resistance, set the precedent for a new conscription army. Comparable to similar European armies of his time, Nader's drive for a disciplined military force increasingly entailed an element of proto-national integration. Long campaigns under unified command and with the reward of shared booty instilled a sense of unanimity and emphasized pronounced elements of shared identity, such as standardized insignia in campaigns, the use of Shahnameh legendary motifs, and later the creation of a new royal crown for himself instead of the Safavid Kezelbash cap. The effective use of firearms, matchlocks, and light artillery, with which he quickly equipped his army once he got hold of the Safavid arsenal in the big cities, also proved crucial in giving Nader's troops a mobility and tactical advantage, and in boosting their morale and semblance of a modern military discipline. Nader himself became a champion of national assertiveness, distinct from the late Safavid's public image of debauchery on the one hand and excessive religiosity on the other. Even before taking Isfahan, Nader was adamant that he would repulse the Ottoman occupation with force if necessary. But unlike campaigns of the Safavid era, Nader did not rely on Shia identity to garner support. Rather, he was campaigning against Ottomans almost purely on territorial grounds. It was as though prevailing over the Afghan enemy subliminated, at least momentarily, Nader's personal ambitions into a patriotic objective tied to defending the guarded domains and preserving Iran's territorial integrity. As it turned out, this was a project different from carving out a tribal kingdom for himself, with no specific geographical boundary and no ties to its subjects. Beginning in 1730, Nader, now acting as a Safavid regent, proclaimed most of the western provinces in a series of brilliant campaigns. Despite Ottoman reinforcements to fight the unexpected rise of the new contender, the resounding defeat of the Turkish army generated a serious crisis in Istanbul and contributed to the abdication of Sultan Ahmad III. Nader's military pressure to capture the province of Baghdad and the Shiite holy cities, however, met stiff Ottoman resistance. The loss of Baghdad would have become a serious blow to the Ottoman prestige and strategic and commercial interests. With his troops stranded at the Western Front, Nader sensed a greater need for Shiite solidarity. To display his Shiite loyalty, he repaired and gilded Shiite shrines in Mashhad and Shiraz, although he frowned on the demoralized clerical establishment. He still acted with loyalty to the Safavid sovereign, but this lasted for only a short while. Tahmasp's failure to repulse a renewed Ottoman offensive in the west and the subsequent loss of nearly all the territory Nader had temporarily secured gave the latter a long-awaited excuse to remove Tahmasp. In 1732, in a carefully staged scene in an Isfahan palace, designed to display Tahmasp's nocturnal debauchery, Nader persuaded the state notables and chiefs of the army to depose the Shah and replace him on the throne with his 18-month-old son, Abbas III, for whom Nader was regent. As a de facto ruler of the country, some 7 years after his emergence, Nader could act with greater facility in making new administrative and military appointments in his favour. He levied heavy taxes to finance a series of campaigns that, between 1732 and 1736, restored all the western and northwestern Iranian provinces occupied by the Ottomans, including Georgia, Armenia, and the economically rich Shamaki, and even established footholds in Ottoman Iraq. Nader's forces crushed the Lezgian revolt in the Caucasus, defeated the restive Galzai Afghans and forced them back to Kandahar, recaptured Herat, restrained the Turkmens of northern Khorasan, forced the Russians to fully evacuate the Caspian provinces, reasserted control over the Persian Gulf. It seemed as though Safavid rule, nominal though it was, had finally restored stability and calm to the empire. So ultimately, Nader Shah, you have this kind of rural Turkmen tribal ruler and his army of Sunni tribesmen restoring the Safavids to the throne, though he deposes to Arslan II when it's convenient to secure his own position. So in a way, you could say that Nader Shah and the Afshars were a more tactful equivalent of the Hotaki Afghans, where he's a tribesman, but he realizes he needs the legitimacy of the Safavids to shore up his own position and then dispense of the Shah when he no longer needs him, rather than the Hotakis who just come crashing in and destroying the system. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Oh, absolutely. But I think it also helps that that the Afshars are a Kizilbash tribe, a very old Kizilbash tribe that come within, Safavid Iran. These are not Afghan tribes from Kandahar. Kandahar is a place that a lot of Americans are familiar with. It's a important town in Western Afghanistan for reasons of recent history. It's very important place, and yeah, again also parallels the ferocity that the Afghans caused in Isfahan and in Iran, kind of also parallels Kandahar in the 21st century from the American experience. But yeah, Nader Shah, as you said, he was a prototype of a more nationalist figure. But I think there's also something that we need to discuss: the division, or maybe not division, but the rivalry between the northern Iran and southern Iran, which we're going to get into more. In northern Iran, you have the Afshars and the Qajars, who are again two factions that are competing with each other. But in southern Iran is the more Persian. It's not Turkic, it's not Kizilbash, it's more Persian, especially around Fars province. It's a very prosperous province, and this is kind of there's an interesting tug of war in the Persian identity and the national identity of Iran in the Kizilbash in the north versus the Persians in the Fars province in the south. If you have anything more to say on that.
Well, I do just want to quickly address a couple of comments in the chat. So, John, not real name. I was worried I've missed too much. Was there any attempt to sedentarize the tribes? Is it surprising that a country full of nomads was establishing such a cultural entity? Well, not really, no. And the thing is that the Safavids cynically were using the tribes they gave them land called sayurgs, or pastoral domains, in these frontier provinces to ensure there was a local defense that could react to raids from the Uzbeks. That was the whole point of them. But yes, you could argue that long term, the inability to properly integrate them into a national identity or army did come to bite the Safavids in the arse. So yes, it's a double-edged sword to use that expression. And Egypt managed to stay Western army in the 1800s. Was Iran able to get there earlier? Yes, Nader Shah's army was very high quality. It was very disciplined. He had lots of gunpowder units. The difference is that it was very multi-ethnic. Again, Afghans, Turkmen,
Uzbeks.
Yeah, Uzbeks as well. So, yes. And your last comment, Khorasan, that's a planet in Star Wars, right? I didn't mention Khorasan. I'm very sorry if I said a word that sounded like Khorasan, but no, I did not mean to say Khorasan.
Khorasan is the northeastern Iranian region. It's spelled a little differently, but it sounds like Khorasan.
Yes, so Khorasan is this region where you see Mashhad. It was the Afshar power base. And what's really interesting with speaking of power bases is that despite, because we're because in 1736, and what happens is Nader Shah feels confident enough where he calls a assembly at the plain of Mugan in the north of the country, where he proposes deposing the Safavids and making himself the Shah. And this assembly at Mugan is a complete rip-off of earlier Turco-Mongol Kurultai, where you'd have these Mongol rulers who'd call these assemblies to elect a new Khan when the previous Khan died. And that's what he does in the style of like the Il Khans. So again, that element of the tribal periphery, and one of the reasons he also does this.
Just on that point, he also calls an assembly in Isfahan of all the Persian elite factions, like all the Persian elite factions are there. The Sheikh al-Islam of Isfahan, the Armenian Patriarch, the city notables, all of these very, very important people in Isfahan. He calls this assembly, and it's kind of the first like inkling of democratic legitimacy. That legitimacy is not based on the Shah and the monarch, but placed on the consensus of the elites and the peoples, and that the Nader Shah is the deputy of the people. This is actually a very important assembly that takes place, and this is also one of these proto-nationalist ideas that Nader introduces to Iran, which is just a very interesting tidbit on that.
No, what's interesting, isn't it? It's almost like his legitimacy is not from being of some illustrious noble bloodline or any blessing from Allah or being a Sayyid or even a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. His legitimacy is his sword. In fact, a very famous title Nader Shah liked to use was the son of the sword, and that's how he sometimes it is referred to as. And so there's this idea that he's this tribal warlord and he's conquering this empire from scratch, and this is the basis of his power and legitimacy, and that's why he deserves to rule Iran. So again, it's almost a sundering of this traditional theocratic view of Iranian kingship.
It's also the first time one of the keys to his legitimacy is also the territorial integrity of the guarded domains of Iran. And this is something Amanat says explicitly. The territorial integrity of the guarded domains of Iran is why Nader Shah was so successful and so secure in his power, other than his cruelty towards his enemies.
No, certainly. And speaking of cruelty, because I was talking about this assembly at Mogan, what's interesting is one of the reasons he does this is that he wants elite consent, because he has all of the elites turn up and essentially proclaim him the Shah. So it's this idea of government by consent. And what's interesting is that the Sheikh al-Islam, who was in attendance, mutters under his breath that he says like an insult or something, like like I don't respect you or something, and Nader Shah overhears this and has the Sheikh al-Islam like summarily executed in front of everybody. And so this is a tension in his reign between him, again, this idea of the center versus the periphery. So you have the Persian bureaucracy, the Divan and the Ulama against the army. You've got this Turkic tribal army versus the Persian Divan and the Arabic Ulama. And that's the real tension of Nader Shah's reign. And speaking, you talk about Khorasan as being a Shahid power base. Well, Nader Shah wouldn't really spend very much time in Isfahan in his reign. In fact, he would very famously say that my capital was on the back of a horse. So you could really see him not so much as a conventional Iranian Shah, but essentially as a kind of Napoleon figure, as this kind of great military generalissimo who sees his reign not as acting in the interest of the Iranian people, but just as a great tribal war machine that's just using the country to extract resources from to keep carrying on more conquering. And regarding this comparison I made to Napoleon, but Nader Shah, another of his nicknames in the West is that he's known as the Persian Napoleon. And if you want my opinion, I think it's more accurate to say that Napoleon was the French Nader Shah, because one, Nader Shah again predates yes. Napoleon by several years, and secondly, Napoleon himself read about Nader Shah and was deeply fascinated by him and wanted to emulate him somewhat. So there you have it.
This is true. This is another, what's it called? Eurocentrism. No offense, no offense, but it is true.
No, certainly. And regarding his conflict with the ulama, well, one of the things Nader Shah does at this assembly at Mogan is that he proclaims a radically new religious policy for the country. He calls for the renunciation of Twelver Shi'ism and wants to adopt a more moderate form called the Jafari Creed, named after Jafar al-Sadiq, the sixth Imam, which was less exclusionary towards Sunni Islam. He hopes by doing this will allow better relations with the Ottomans and other Sunni powers. And there's also a practical reason, because many of the mercenaries and soldiers in his army are Sunnis. Again, they're Uzbeks, Afghans, or Turkmen who are Sunnis and not Shias. So he wants to bind better loyalty to him personally. And so you can see why he wants to do this. However, as you can imagine, the Shia ulama absolutely reject this, because it goes against the struggle of the past couple of centuries and greatly undermines the identity that had been created for Iran. And this ends up being a bit of a failed policy, because the Ottomans couldn't ever accept a more moderate form of Shiism, even the Jafari Creed. And because one of the other reasons Nader Shah adopted this is he hopes it would give him greater legitimacy with the Sunni populations of the Ottoman Empire, because he hopes in a future war of conquest, which he would launch in the 1740s, that the subjects would then view him as their rightful ruler, therefore strengthening his claim to those territories. So again, it's a failed policy, because he alienates a powerful elite within the country, and it fails in the objective he wanted to achieve with it. And furthermore, we're speaking military campaigns, and now want to talk about Nader Shah's greatest success of his career, which is his Indian campaign. So in 1738, he invades Afghanistan. He conquers Kandahar, and then he marches through the Khyber Pass into the Mughal Empire, and he defeats the Mughals, Padishah Nasir al-Din Muhammad Shah, at the Battle of Karnal. And what he then does is he essentially holds the Mughal court hostage with his army. And again, we talk about, Turco-Mongol comparisons, but Nader Shah was fascinated by Tamerlane and very much wanted to emulate him. And Tamerlane himself had invaded India and sacked Delhi in the early 15th century. So again, Nader Shah, he's almost copying Tamerlane, though when he occupied the capital, he didn't actually want to sack it, because again, he wants instead to extract the wealth and booty without destroying the city. And so what's very interesting is that he has his soldiers garrisoned around the city, and he strictly punishes any infraction. So any conflict between any Shia soldiers and any Sunnis is punished. Any rapes or attacks are punished. And what he's doing is he's trying to negotiate with the Padishah a kind of essentially a treaty. But what ends up happening is a lot of the locals in Delhi decide to rebel and try and force the army out. And when there's violence against his forces, Nader Shah can't tolerate this. So he then orchestrates. Now, this event sometimes gets mistold. It's often told as a massacre, but that would be a bit of a not accurate way of describing what happened. So Nader Shah doesn't just let his soldiers go on like a mass campaign of rape and pillaging. What he does is that he gets his 20,000 of his best soldiers, he deploys them to various districts in Delhi, and then while this happens, he deploys himself on the top of a nearby building, where he's in full view of all his soldiers in the city. And then with a gesture of his hands, he orders them to start a coordinated massacre of the troublesome regions in the city. And this is allowed to go on for a few hours, and it results in the deaths of tens of thousands. And then after he thinks sufficient punishment has been enacted, with one gesture, he orders his men to stop, and they withdraw. So as you can see, so this is not just a simple rape and pillage. This is a organized, coordinated display of violence and power over a conquered enemy. And with this move, Nader Shah was able to negotiate with the Padishah a treaty where the Padishah is allowed to remain in charge, but he has to give a huge bounty to Nader Shah. He has to surrender his entire treasury, including many priceless items such as the Peacock Throne, the Kur-Inur diamond, and the Darya-Inur diamond. The entire war booty amounts to about 700 million rupees, and it's one of the largest cases of booty ever extracted in modern history.
I know what you were trying to say there.
Yes.
You were trying to phrase it appropriately.
Yeah, so I mean, in other language, you could say yes, this is a great sack of a city, but I think that doesn't really properly articulate what Nader Shah did here. He isn't just some tribal bandit who's just coming in and just raping and murdering everything. He is almost like a kind of this is essentially like, obviously, just to compare it to like the mafia. Obviously, we've all seen the original Godfather film where at the end Michael's at the christening of his godson, and he has all his men launch this like coordinated assassinations against his various enemies. That's what Nader Shah does effectively, just a larger version of that. It's a coordinated display of violence to cow his enemies. It's again showing that he's incredibly tactful and sophisticated. One of the reasons he does this is that if he just lets his men go around raping and murdering, then all of the booty is just going to go missing. It's just going to go into the pockets of his soldiers. Whereas this way, he ensures the Mughals hand it over to his personal control, meaning he can then dish out the booty as reward to his followers. So again, he's a military genius in that respect.
No, absolutely. And one of the things that Nader Shah does, he's an incredible hoarder of all of this booty. That there's a page in Amanat's book where he goes into detail of like the amount of booty he hoards in the capital of Isfahan from all of these conquests. Just a huge amount of money and resources from the treasury. It's pretty incredible to see. There was one thing I wanted to add. The Indian campaign is very, very, very successful, but with problems across with other rebellions in the empire, specifically in like Kurdistan and Dagestan, which is in the Caucasus. His attention is driven elsewhere, and he does have to leave India eventually. But yeah, sorry, what did you want to say?
Well, what I was going to say is regarding hoarding the booty. No, he doesn't hoard it in Isfahan. He has a fortress he has in Khorasan called Kalat, and it's an old Persian word that means fortress, and it's this giant like fortification that he's built, and that's where he holds the wealth. And so again, this idea that I'm not going to put it in the center. I don't want the divan getting their hands on my hard-won booty. I'm going to keep it in my own secure regional castle.
Yeah, Nader Shah was a tribal warlord, and he ruled Persia as a tribal warlord for his entire reign.
No, certainly. And regarding the Indian campaign, so yes, he did have to leave due to these other rebellions. But what he does is that by leaving, because he speculates annexing the Mughal Empire, but he realizes that wouldn't be practical long term because the empire is so huge, it would leave him overstretched. And so what he decides to do is that the Mughal ruler is weak. I will leave him in charge with a warning that if things go wrong, I will return. And so therefore, he ensures that the Mughals stay weak because they're stuck with a weak ruler, and also he doesn't, because by not deposing Nasr al-Din, he ensures that another more powerful rival doesn't take over the throne and then be a threat to Nader Shah. But by ensuring there's a weak ruler, it gives him a pretext to intervene if there's like an uprising or things go wrong. And then in future, Nader Shah could always like annex more or extract more from the Mughals. So it's an ingenious strategy. If only Nader Shah lived longer than he did. So, and this event, as Amanat alludes to, leads to a terminal decline in the Mughal Empire because Nasr al-Din would eventually die in 1748, the year after Nader Shah did, and the Mughal Empire which was once this great empire, by the mid 18th century would just deflate to just being Delhi and nothing else. And this is the power vacuum that allows the British to eventually come in and establish rule in India. And so from this point, it should also be noted that while he was away in India, Nader Shah actually had his son Reza acting as regent. And what ends up happening next is Nader is very paranoid and doesn't quite trust his son, because what happens is while he's away, the son hears a rumor that his father's been killed and assassinated. So to prop up the Afsharid position, Reza has Tahmasp II and Abbas III both murdered. And now I can understand why Reza does this, because again, if he believes his father's dead, he needs to shore up their own position. However, Nader Shah sees this as his son trying to usurp him, and he has his own son blinded. And this is, again, something that Nader Shah would eventually come to regret and would actually drive him mad and insane, because he would come... Yeah, so you want to add to that?
Oh, no, keep going. I'm going to add to that after you finish.
Yes, and so again, we see again shades of Abbas I, executing and torturing and killing his various sons. Again, coming, strong, effective rulers. I don't think killing all your offspring is exactly a productive thing to do long term.
No, and yet many Shahs keep doing it. Many such cases. But yeah, this from this point on, the incapacitation of Reza, his son. Nader Shah, he goes from warlord, military genius, savior, to tyrant, mad king, insanity, and all that stuff. A lot of the sources of the time increasingly detail his what's called fall into insanity at this time, and this obviously leads to his death in 1747 at the hands of his nephew. His nephew is known as.
No, it's not. Sorry, it's not his nephew. No, no, he's murdered by Persian officers within the army. And to get to why that happened. So, with his insanity and arbitrary nature, there keep being these tribal ethnic uprisings against his rule. So he has to keep cracking down on them. Because after the Indian campaign, Nader then invades Central Asia, and so you can see on this map, he temporarily occupies Samarkand, and he also later in 1740s invades the Ottoman Empire to try and conquer Iraq. But both these conquests are ephemeral, and he's never able to consolidate them because he keeps getting these tribal uprisings in various parts of the empire. So he's having to play, whack-a-mole with revolts, and he's never able to consolidate. And what ends up happening is that he keeps favouring the promotion of these Sunni, Afghan, Uzbek, Turkmen officers in his army, and sidelining Persians in the army officers. And in 1747, it's Persian officers who kill him off because they overhear that he plans to remove all Persian officers from the army. And so, seeing their position threatened, they make the first move and kill Nader Shah. And that's what leads to his death in 1747.
Yeah, okay, my apologies. His nephew is an important figure. His name is Ahmed Shah Durrani, but he's important not because he's the nephew of Nader Shah, but also because he goes on to found the Afghan Empire, the Durrani Empire. So yes, it was not Ahmed Shah Durrani who killed him, but it was the Kizilbash Persian officers of the military. Yeah, just wanted to add that point.
Certainly, it's interesting is that Ahmad Shah Durrani, in a way, was more of a successor to Nader Shah than any of the other Afsharids, which we'll get to in a moment. So I mentioned that Reza had been blinded. Well, Reza actually had a son called Shahrukh Mirza. And it's very interesting because this is, again, another parallel with Tamerlane, because Tamerlane's son and heir was also called Shahrukh. And so Nader Shah has his grandson named after Tamerlane's successor. Again, more of these parallels. But it's interesting because what ends up happening is that when Nader Shah dies, one of the other Afshars, his nephew, organizes Reza and many of the other Afshars in Khorasan, and then he has like a huge massacre of many of these other members, and he declares himself Shah. and then there's all this infighting that goes on and back and forth, and eventually Shah Rukh Mirza is proclaimed the Shah in 1748, and he lives then for almost another 48 years until 1796. But and it's interesting is that despite him being Shah, as you look on this map on the right, Iran effectively implodes once Nader Shah dies. It breaks out into all these little tribal dynastic holdings, and the Afshars are only really able to exert control over Khorasan and the east. And it's very interesting comparing Shah Rukh Mirza to the Shah Rukh Timurid, because again, when Shah Rukh took over the Timurid Empire, most of that empire imploded, and he was largely ruling this core that was in Afghanistan around Herat. So again, it's just interesting parallels. I would argue that Shah Rukh Mirza was less effective as a ruler than Shah Rukh Timurid.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The decade after the death of Nader Shah is again, this is part of the decline, very precipitous decline of Persia and Iran. The breakup of all these tribal chiefs, the breakup of the multi-ethnic loyalties that were united under Nader Shah, just like he was the strong man holding it all together. And after he dies, yeah, all these ethnic tribes just take over their own territory, and the increase in looting and banditry, the depopulation of the rural countryside, the civil war between the Qajars and the Zands in northern Iran, which we're gonna get into probably in the next chapter, because before the Qajars are a very important dynasty, of course, but before the Qajars, there's this interregnum of the Zands, who also come from a very similar area, and I think northern Khorasan. If you want to touch on that briefly.
Yes, well, the Zands are actually from the west. They're from Fars, and what's really interesting is they're actually able to consolidate around the central region under. They're led by a man called Karim Khan Zand, and so in 1751 he's able to take over Shiraz and Fars and Isfahan, and from there, over the next couple of decades, he's able to expand rule and control over most of the rest of Iran throughout his reign until 1778 when he dies. And what's really fascinating with Karim Khan Zand is that he doesn't take the title of Shah. He actually has another title, which is the Vakil o Raoya, literally translated into English, that that roughly means the shepherd or regent of the flock. But it's more commonly translated as deputy of the people. And so you can almost say that, I am not a Shah. I don't have any kingly authority. However, I am here as a kind of regent or a stabilizer to rebuild the country from. And what I do just want to do is do another little reading from Armanat, so on Karim Khan Zand. So I'm just going to bring that up for one moment. So okay, so with Nader's death, his short-lived empire, stretching from Marv and Herat to Georgia and Dagestan and on to Bahrain and the shores of the Persian Gulf, plunged into turmoil. The mosaic of nomadic and semi-nomadic people took part in a pandemonium that took at least another decade before a semblance of tranquility would emerge under Karim Khan Zand. Despite 3 attempts by Nader's successors to try and stabilize his amorphous empire, the Afsharid base in Khorasan proved too fragile to allow for an orderly transition. Besides jealousy guarding the remnants of Nader's hoarded treasures in Kalat, which came to be a curse rather than a blessing, his successors could barely subordinate Nader's unruly army. No matter how generously and hurriedly they squandered his legendary wealth in exchange for loyalties, nor were they able to hold together from Mashhad or from Isfahan the disjointed provinces of his empire. The ensuing struggle for power plunged Iran to another civil war that lasted a whole decade. By 1757, the rise of Karim Khan Zand in the south was the only positive outcome. His regency was the most benign and durable of any attempts in 1722 to revive a nominal Safavid rule and govern in the shadow of its memory. Contrary to Nader's diabolical temper, Karam's personality combined political sagacity and soldierly valour with beneficence, acumen, and conviviality, a rare combination, especially when compared to his cohorts. His rule of more than 2 decades marks one of the most tranquil in Iran's early modern history, a remarkable example of how the ruler's personal qualities, rather than the institutional framework within which he operated, determined political instability, the well-being of subjects and cultural florescence. Under favourable conditions fostered by the Zand dynasty, founded by Karam Khan, Shiraz and the whole of the Fars province, which had been terribly suffered under Nader, quickly bounced back. Brought up in exile in northern Khorasan, Karam belonged to the Lak, a sub-tribe of the Zands and part of the lesser division of Lurs of western Iran. They were banished by Nader to the northeastern frontier, presumably to guard against the Uzbeks. Karam had found in the Afshar campaigns, involuntary perhaps, even though Nader had eliminated all senior members of his tribe. After Nader's assassination, Karam led the return of the Zand contingent back to their ancestral homeland in the Mayala region in Luristan. From there, over the course of the ensuing civil war, he eventually became master of Fars province with Shiraz as his base. The Zand victory in effect reaffirmed the ascendancy of the southern Iranian interior, albeit Lur and still tribal, over the mostly northern Turkic periphery, an ascendant tied to a new sense of Persian awareness. Karam Khan's reluctance to assume royal authority independent of nominal Safavid sovereignty gave his rule a distinctive character. He learned from Nader's mistakes. He was realistic enough to acknowledge the place of Shiite faith and wise enough to respect devolution to the Safavid memory. Sorry, that should be devotion to the Safavid memory. Karam's choice to remain a Vakil al-Dole, deputy of the state, however, was a subtle shift from acting as a mere regent of the obscure Safavid prince, a non-entity, by allowing reference to himself as the deputy of the subjects, Vakil al-Rayoya. Moreover, he seemed to have implicitly shifted his own mandate to that of a deputizing people rather than the mere Safavid kingship. The subtle shift corresponded to Karam's popularity with his subjects, especially the urban population, distancing himself from the tormenting experience of the recent past. He further relied on the legends of Iranian kingship closely associated with Fars province. Though the extent of such Persian awareness should not be exaggerated, it is evident in the literary and material culture of the period, tracing the Zand revival back to Fars as the cradle of Persian culture and its rich poetic tradition was one example. Wider use of the term Iran as an alternative to the guarded domains of Iran is another. Interest in rebuilding cities under Karam Khan went along with revitalization of the Persian Gulf trade and development of Shiraz as its hub. Consolidation of the Zand soon gravitated the political centre, at least temporarily, towards the south and away from the perils of surrounding Isfahan, Kazvin, Tabriz, and Mashhad. Similar to Abbas I, Karam Khan created an urban complex commemorating his political achievements. His reconstruction projects complemented and at times replaced Safavid public buildings and palaces. Most notable among Karam Khan's grand edifices were the new bazaar, the mosque, and the new citadel, together forming the core of the new urban development. The Zand's material heritage, while incomparable in grandiosity to Isfahan of the Safavid era, was remarkable for what it accomplished in the short period of time. It was also notable for its innovations. The design features of the Vakil Mosque, a vast space of more than 90,000 square feet, built between 1751 and 1773, for example, served to reaffirm a new political agenda. The absence of any dome structure in particular may be seen as a break from the glorification of Safavid royal patronage. The use of 48 single-piece marble columns throughout the mosque's vast prayer hall, the well-proportioned courtyards and high ivans, arched portals, 2 instead of the usual 4, shows artistic confidence. So again, under Karam Khan Zand, we're getting this reorientation towards the centre and the cultural flourishing and material stability in around Shiraz and the Fars province. And something else Karam Khan Zand's also able to do is he starts expanding trade into the Persian Gulf. And he also, very interestingly, he establishes friendly relations with the Ottomans, and he actually is able to occupy Basra, giving him more strategic control over the Persian Gulf. So again, you've got this. He's trying to balance all these different factions and cities together to try and rebuild the shattered country, and he doesn't go off on any exciting military campaign. So in a way, he's kind of an anti-Nader Shah. What would you say to that?
No, he was definitely a much wiser ruler, even if he was not the military conqueror that Nader Shah was. He played his cards very well, and he did try his very best to keep all the tribes in line and keep order and public stability as the number one priority. He was not in control of the entire, like, the eastern half of the empire. The Fars Persian base and the population of that area was very different than the Kizilbash tribes that were going on in the east. But he was a very interesting ruler. I think we should get more into him and of course into the Zands and the Qajars in our next stream. I apologize, but I do have a hard out in about 2 minutes. So that's all I have for today. There's a lot of interesting things that are going on, especially in the Persian Gulf. I mentioned the Omani pirates in the beginning of the stream, but interestingly, continuing under first under Abbas I, and then Nader Shah, and now Karim Khan, the Persians never establish a good navy. They're never able to access the maritime trade and merchant fleet that other powers, or especially the Ottomans. So the Ottomans had an enormous fleet, and the Russians are very famous for their fleet as well. But they can never get past the caravan system of trade and increase that maritime power to the extent where it would, have influence over the economy.
No, certainly, and yeah, I think we've done. I mean, it was a tall order trying to cover this vast stretch of history. So yes, we'll stop with talking about this today, and next time we'll talk a little bit more about the Zands, and then we'll look at the rise of the Qajars under Aga Mohammed Shah. So thank you everybody for watching. Just gonna make sure we've not had any super chats come in. That doesn't look like we have. So okay, well, thank you everybody for watching, and we'll see you around.